We're going to be deep in the Old Testament. 1 Samuel chapter 27. This is a story that it spans over a few chapters. We're not going to read the whole story detail for detail, obviously, because it's quite a few chapters long to get the full grasp of everything that was going on here. But it still amazes me that there's not been a movie made after this story. It's that wild. There's that many twists and turns, that much. This story has everything. It has action, it has betrayal, it has romance, it has everything that you would think that, a movie would have, this story by itself. And so I'm going to be doing some paraphrasing today, just on as far as the facts of the story goes, so that we can kind of stay up to pace and get what actually I believe the revelation for the body is today. So where we're at right now, at this point, David is not yet, his becoming king is not like official. Saul's still the king, but David is, God has already spoken. David is the next king of Israel. But at this moment, Saul is still alive. And so, David has not quite yet taken the throne, but everything is coming to fruition. Everything is right there at the end. And so at this point in the story, Saul is becoming increasingly more frustrated with David, simply because David's popularity is growing. David is having tremendous success in battles, and so therefore the people, their hearts are turning towards David. They're acknowledging David more and more and more, and this is enraging Saul even more. And so at this point, Saul has already attempted to kill David a couple of times, and David has spared his life already a couple of times. And so this one is going to be the final pursuit. This is the final moment where Saul is going to attempt to try to get at David, and David is going to flee for what is going to be the final time before Saul is going to lose his life and all this kind of stuff. So this is kind of coming in at the end of the story. And so between chapters 27 and chapter 30, if you want to mark these and go home and read them, they are a fantastic story of what happens here. So we're going to be in chapter 27 for a second, and then we're going to skip over to chapter 30. But we're going to kind of read in chapter 27 to kind of get the gist of what's happening at this moment. So David has been warned that Saul's, he's still after you. He's going to kill you. He's done with it. He's really coming after you. And so in verse 1 of chapter 27, it says, "Then David said in his heart, 'Now I shall perish one day by the hand of Saul. There's nothing better for me that I should escape to the land of the Philistines. Then Saul will despair of seeking me any longer within the borders of Israel, and I shall escape out of his hand.'" So David is saying in his heart, he's deciding something here, that if I stay here, if I stay in Israel, Saul's going to kill me. So David, his only option, now you remember a few weeks ago we were reading out of Psalms, and one of the promises that is also a command that we see in the Old Testament is to dwell in the land. To dwell in the land forever. And we talked about how the land is symbolic here of the promise of God, because the physical land that Israel was living in and dwelling in was a promise. And so it was symbolic here of the promise and the covenant that comes from the Lord. And so to dwell in the land meant to remain within the bounds of the promise, the faithfulness, the covenant that God has established. And so right here, David is considering fleeing this land, and the only option that he has, because once you get outside of Israel, once you cross that border, there is no friendly territory. Everywhere outside of the border of Israel was considered enemy territory. And one of the worst enemies of all the enemies was the Philistines. If you've spent much time in the Old Testament, you've seen Israel go up against the Philistines quite a few times. And so David is saying, the only place safe for me to go is into the land of the Philistines. If I get there, Saul's not going to come over there and try to find me. And he'll leave me alone, and then we'll just have to deal with the Philistine issue once we get over there. And so this is what David has decided in his heart. I want to talk with you today about how we deal with spiritual warfare. And I want to talk with you about something that David is going to encounter in the midst of this decision, what this decision is going to lead to. But right now, I want to start with how we can be just like David. This is one of the first things that the enemy always attempts to do, and that is to talk us out of the land, to do anything and say anything and get us to consider any way possible to get us to leave the land that God has got us dwelling in, to abandon the promises, the truth, and the security that is found within the presence of God. Satan is going to tell you anything he needs to say to get you to at least consider leaving that land, leaving that promise. David right now, the only reason that he would even think this is because of the danger that he is under. We have to be aware, as Paul says in Ephesians, of the schemes of the devil. When you are facing trial, when you are facing pressures and resistances of life that are coming against you, both mild and wild, you have to realize that in those moments is your most vulnerable spiritual moments that you're going to have, okay? That when you have a lot of stuff going on up here and you're being pulled in 100 different directions and you don't know which way to go or how this is going to work out or how long this is going to take or how much this is going to cost, spiritually we are incredibly vulnerable at those moments. David is vulnerable at this moment. His family's at risk. By this time, David has his own following. He has his own army. There is families that are committed to David. He's got a lot of people underneath him, a lot of people with him, and he's considering all of this stuff. And it's a life or death situation. And so he considers going into enemy territory to find safety. There's probably people in this room that have made the same decision David makes right here. Where you were in a good place, stresses of life begin to compound, and you felt like your only option was to go backwards. Go backwards. Times where you knew you should have prayed, you didn't. You reacted in anger. You slandered. You rebelled. You went back to old habits instead of doing what you knew you should have done, which would have been dwelling and remaining in the land that God has placed you in. God's already established David as king, but in this moment, he's listening more to his emotions and his fears than he is what God is saying and what's actually happening. So David here is trying to consider the best option, and let's get out of here. Let's get to enemy territory. A lot of times, the best option may be to go to these places that are comfortable, these places that are familiar, even though it is enemy territory. This is no different than Israel being coming out of Egypt, heading to this promised land, but yet when they lack food and water, thinking that, well, let's just go back to Egypt. Let's go back to what's familiar. Yes, we are slaves there, but at least we had shelter and food and water and whatnot. And so David here is making a very, very risky decision. So long story short, he does it. He gathers his family, his wives, his children, his men, all of their families, their livestock, their possessions, everything, and they flee to Philistine territory. They get to Philistine territory, and they actually make a deal with one of the commanders of the army. Says, look, how about this? We'll fight for you. We'll be on your side if you will let us stay here safely. We will help you in battle. We will be on your team. And you can imagine David comes in with a warrior reputation that they're a little bit suspicious of him. How much can we trust this guy? But nonetheless, he wins the favor of one guy, and he's like, all right, that sounds good to me. A little bit of time rolls on, and guess who the Philistines are about to go up against? They're about to go up against Israel. And so David here now is in a situation where he's about to have to himself and ask his men to go fight against their own people. To stand with the enemy against his own people. And David is willing to do this. Now we may look at this and go, what is he thinking? Why is David even considering this? I mean, this is his people. Yeah, Saul is his problem, but why go fight against your own people alongside of the enemy? And I'm saying all of these details because I want you to imagine what David is thinking, and I want you to wonder what his men are thinking. What do you think's going through their heads? They've left their homeland. They've got their wife and children under the stress of travel and flee. They've got their animals under the stress of traveling and fleeing. They're not in the security of their homes. They're not in the security of their land. They're in the middle of enemy territory. And now their leader comes and says, we're going to have to go stand against our own people. What do you think his men are thinking? Do you think that they're a little overwhelmed mentally, physically, emotionally with all of this stuff? Now we may look at David here and say David is off his rocker. David has lost it. How can a man of God fight and war against his own people like this? But I want you to know something. This is exactly what Christians do every single day. Every day Christians make decisions to war against their own people. We do this through things like jealousy, selfishness, envy. If you go read James chapter 3, verses 15 and 16, he says these things are demonic in nature. And where you find this sort of attitude, you will find destruction and disobedience of every type. As Christians, one of the things that Satan wants to do is divide and get us to war against one another. And in this situation, when we function and we agree with jealousy and we agree with envy and we agree with this emotion towards other Christians, our own brothers and sisters, because we have our own insecurities and we have our own fears and our own confusions that we're refusing to deal with and ask the Lord to heal us and deliver us from. Instead, we think the best option is just to hold something against another brother or another sister. We're doing exactly what David is agreeing to do here. We're agreeing to stand and war against our own people. So his men are up to here. Thankfully, one of the leaders of the Philistine army comes and he says, look, I don't trust David. I don't trust him no further than I can throw him. We're going to get into battle with Israel, and he's going to turn around. He's going to fight against us. So he does not permit David to take his men with them in battle against Israel. David's upset by this. He's frustrated by this because, again, he's panicking. He's panicking here. He's trying to survive. So David gathers his men. They march back to where they were encamped in the land of the Philistines. In verse 1 of chapter 30, it says, now when David and his men came to Ziklag on the third day, the Amalekites had made a raid against Negeb and against Ziklag. They had overcome Ziklag and burned it with fire, and had taken captive the women and all who were in it, both small and great. They killed no one, but carried them off and went their way. And when David and his men came to the city, they found it burned with fire, and their wives and their sons and their daughters taken captive. Then David and the people who were with him raised their voices and wept until they had no more strength to weep. Imagine this, man. You've left your homeland, all the stresses of fleeing from the enemy, joining with the enemy against your own people. Now, to come back to your wives, your children, your livestock. Imagine these men. I'm sure these men, I just keep thinking about David's men. And I'm sure that they're up to here with all of this. And they're probably thinking, though, I can't wait to see my wife. I can't wait to at least get back to the camp and at least see my wife and kids. Man, this has been the craziest few weeks. At least when I get back, I'll be able to see them and have some normalcy. Only when they get back, the Amalekites had raided, kidnapped everybody, all of their wives, all of their children, all of their livestock, everything was gone. And everything that was not taken was burned. You think his men were a little frustrated with him? You think his men are looking at him and going, we shouldn't even be here. We shouldn't even be in the land of the Philistines. Had you not decided to come over here, to flee from Saul, we wouldn't even be here. My wife would still be here. My kids would still be here. My livestock, my whole livelihood would still be here. And I would still be at home had you not made that decision. That's the easiest thing to do, guys. When Satan attacks, and there is loss, and there is destruction, and there is hurt, and there's all the confusion and the fear and the desperation and everything that these men are feeling, the easiest thing to do in this moment is to blame. Right? Well, if you hadn't this, and if you hadn't this. I think back to Adam. Lord, the woman you gave me. You know. But here's the question. Is that going to get your wife and kids back? Is that going to get your livestock back? Is that going to get back what was stolen from you to blame? The Bible even says, if we go on to read, the men were even getting ready to stone David. They're getting ready to kill him. They're that over it. I want to speak with you about reclaiming what the enemy has taken. This is something that a lot of Christians, a truth that a lot of Christians are not aware of. A lot of Christians have had the enemy steal from them, take from them what God has blessed and entrusted with, and are under the assumption that, well, it's just gone. It's just gone. All of the fruit of the Spirit, my gifts, my opportunity, my position, everything, it once was there, now it's not. I love verse 6. It says, and David was greatly distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him, because all the people were bitter in soul, each for his sons and daughters. But I love this last part. But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. If you were in our midweeks this past week, we talked about the word consider. The difference between great faith and little faith is the people of great faith consider the Lord in times of hurt and fear. Where it would be easy to go with the emotional route, people of great faith consider the Lord. They consider his works. They consider his promises. They consider his truth, his instruction. They stop. They pause for a second, and they consider the Lord in the midst of chaos. That's what people of great faith do. That's what David does right here. When things are at their peak, his family's gone. He's driven out of the land. His life is in danger, not only by Saul, but now by his own men. David, he stops and he considers the Lord. He stops and he strengthens himself in the Lord. He calls to the priest. He gets and says, bring the ephod over here. We've got to go seek the Lord in prayer. And so David does this. The priest comes and he goes and he seeks the Lord. And David asks a question in verse 8. And David inquired of the Lord, shall I pursue after this band? Shall I overtake them? When David is considering the Lord, he says, God, do I go and get my stuff back? Is it worth it? I mean, it's been one bad thing after another up to this point. Do we need to go do this? Do we need to go? What David is really asking is, Lord, if I go after these guys, are you going to go with me? That's what he's really asking. Will you bless? Is your favor, is it your will, Lord, that I go after the enemy and reclaim back from him what was stolen from me? Will you go with me into that battle? That's what David's really asking. I think this is interesting here. Because David does not make this decision, I believe, out of pride and confidence. Because at this moment, I don't think he has a whole lot of either one of those things. I think after weeks of bad decisions and betrayals and this type of loss and these types of threats, I don't think David's confidence in himself is very high right now. I think David has hit a place of total surrender where he's like, Lord, I need you. I need you. I need you to, we've got a mess here. One of the things that we have the temptation to do when we're in the position of David is we carry the blame so heavily that we don't even consider asking the Lord for help. We don't even consider asking the Lord for restoration, for healing, for recovery. We don't even consider, because we are so busy blaming ourselves. David could have sat here and said, guys, just stone me, kill me. That's what I deserve. That's what I'm worthy of. I've made bad calls. I made a bad decision. It's because of me we're here. It's all my fault. Just get this over with. That's the attitude a lot of Christians have. There are things that you know that are lost, and you know it's your fault. Yeah, the enemy is the one that took it. The enemy is the one that attacked, yes. But you can look at this stuff and say, but had I not been here, it never would have happened. Had I not been in the enemy territory, that never would have happened. Had I not made this choice, that never would have happened. So we can say, yes, the enemy is the one who took it, but he was only able to do so because of my ignorance or my stubbornness or whatever. And so we condemn ourselves so deeply that we just consider it a loss. And that's, I believe, where David was. I believe he's in that moment. But thankfully, David stops and he strengthens himself in the Lord and says, wait a minute. There's only one other thing, guys. There's only one other. Well, we still have one choice, one option. And he calls on the Lord and says, God, do we go and get our stuff back? And he answered him, pursue, for you shall surely overtake and shall surely rescue. God gives David the green light. Now, I don't know what his men's facial reactions was when he came out and says, guys, we're going to go get our stuff back. I don't know if there was a very cheerful disposition there or what. I don't know. But David was, to me, if I just read here, it seemed as though David was refreshed. There's a new fire in him now. But I want you to notice something here. When we get in these positions and Satan has attacked and we've experienced loss and destruction and theft and all these kind of things, if you're relying on yourself, if you're relying on positive thinking and your own strength and your own creativity and all this stuff to be able to withstand the enemy is going to break you down and wear you down to the point where you give up. I'm just going to tell you that. He will break you down of your own strength. Your only hope is to do exactly what David did, and that is to strengthen yourself in the Lord, consider his promises, consider his heart, to sit and seek him, and allow him to be the one to lead you into battle to regain what the enemy has stolen. At this moment, we have to examine our lives. And we have to ask ourselves, what do we go reclaim and what do we let be lost? Now, obviously, we know that God does purify by fire. So there are sometimes we look at our life and say, this was removed, this was lost, this got taken away. But in my experience as a Christian, you look at those things and say, but I know God removed that, because ever since that's been removed, I've been more free, I've had more peace, I've had more joy. Usually those things are things that we would consider sinful and fleshly and destructive in the first place. So we're fine with that stuff being burned and gone. It did us a favor. But we're talking about the stuff that we are convinced God blessed us with. God gave me this. So David and his men begin to march. And on their way, they're trying to track the band of people that stole their stuff, and they come across a straggler. And this guy's on the verge of death. And he rode with the very band that stole his family. And he says, I got sick about 3 days ago. They were afraid that I would slow the group down, so they left me for dead. So David and them give him food, they give him water, they nurse him. This guy's from Egypt. They're going to take your family, they're going to take your wives, your children, and they're going to sell them as slaves to Egypt. He's a snitch. He snitches. And not only does he snitch, but he leads David and his men to where they're camping. Anytime that I hear Egypt mentioned in the midst of an Israelite like David, I can't help but think of the past and slavery. When we talk about this stuff of reclaiming, guys, how many parents in this room, parents, grandparents, have spent maybe considerably large portions of your life in slavery? You spent large portions of your life struggling. It may have been with an addiction. It may be with hurt or fear or something like that, where you look back and say, I was there, I was bound, I hated it, I was miserable. God has set me free. But now that you have children or grandchildren or nieces or nephews or whoever, how many of you have considered the threats that they're going to be taken and they're going to be hauled back to the same place that used to enslave you? We've all heard generational curses, right? Struggles of one parent that passes on to the next generation, and there's studies that prove the accuracy of that. There's high likeliness of that. It's not a 100% thing, but it's a very high percentage. And I believe as David is gathering this information, that his wife and children could end up being in the place, in the same position that his ancestors were drew out of by the power of God, there was a high rate of concern that welled up inside of him. Now, when we talk about reclaiming our stuff, getting back what the enemy stole, you have to go to Ephesians when Paul is telling us about the armor of God. Because there's a few things about this that need to be understood. I don't think it's much of a point right now to break down every single piece of the armor of God, but instead I want to look at the unifying factors of what they all have in common. The first thing that every single piece of the armor is going to do is they are going to affirm your identity in Christ. Every single piece of the armor is going to stamp of approval, put it in concrete, your identity as a son or a daughter of the Most High God. If you expect to run down an enemy doubting your identity, I would not expect to get too far. I wouldn't expect to get too far. When you go to chase down the enemy, to reclaim what was stolen, you better know who you are. And I'm not joking about that. You better know who you are in Christ Jesus. Not a member of Dwelling Place Church. I help out with this. No. The enemy will laugh that mess and take your stuff and make you watch him walk off with it again. You better walk into his camp knowing who you are. David, when he's seeking the Lord to go after, David's confidence, I believe, was not in his men. It was not in himself. It was not in his weaponry. David's confidence of getting his stuff back was that the Lord's favor was upon him and his approval was there to go do this thing. David's confidence was that the Lord said, yes, go, you'll get it. That was his confidence. My identity, my confidence in my identity is that it is hidden in Christ. He is my confidence. If I'm not assured there, if I'm not solid there, the moment that I show up into the camp, that's the first thing he's going to begin to attack, to get you to doubt your worthiness, to doubt your salvation, to doubt your power, to doubt the forgiveness of the Father. All of these things. We've said this before. If you look back at Jesus when he's tempted by the enemy in the wilderness, the last thing the Father said to him, this is my Son I'm so proud of him. Jesus gets into the wilderness, and every temptation, the first thing Jesus would say to him, if you are the Son of God, if you really are. What is he doing? He's trying to get Jesus to doubt the last thing the Father said to him, which was securing his identity as his son in who he was pleased. You ride into the enemy camp without having that nailed down, he's going to have a heyday with your mind. He's going to have you so twisted around, so suspicious of God, so suspicious of your forgiveness. And look, guys, I'm not just telling you this. I've seen this. I have watched this play out. I have watched the enemy manipulate people where it just starts as just, this simple prayer for restoration, and before you know it, they get so twisted around they don't even know which way is up. And I'm not trying to scare you, but I'm trying to say spiritual warfare is a very real thing, man. It's a very serious thing. But to win in battle is really somewhat easy. Because at the midst of all of the armor, one thing that I can't help but see is rest. When I get secure in my identity, it produces rest. Because it lets me know that this is not a battle and it's not a victory that I will win because of my strength, my creativity, my wisdom, my agility, nothing. That when I ride into that enemy camp, I will reclaim what was lost solely by the strength and the favor of the Lord, not by mine. If you go to the armor of God, one of the pieces, if we're talking about this armor of God, you're familiar with that, and you're going into enemy camp, is there any specific piece of the armor that maybe everybody's thinking of the most? Maybe a sword? I'm just going to be honest with you. If you're going to the enemy camp to get your stuff back and you don't have a weapon, you're not going to get very far. All right? You're not going to get very far. What is the sword in the armor of God? It's the word of the Lord, right? So my weapon for the restoration of what the enemy has stolen, my weapon for this battle is the word itself. But I've watched Christians be under attack, and because they are so obsessed with the fact that they are under attack, so overwhelmed by the fact that Satan is attacking them, that they never draw their sword. They never draw their sword. They're so astonished and shocked that so much tragedy is happening, so much loss has happened, that they are more content just sitting there complaining and venting and confused and blaming than saying, hey, wait a minute, I've got a sword, I've got a horse, or in this case I think it was a camel. Go get my stuff back. I like weapons. I like guns. And I know it's a big controversial debate right now. Should a Christian carry a pistol and all this kind of weapon, whatever it is, all this kind of stuff. And there's a lot I'm not going to get into that obviously this morning, but I like guns, and I have guns, and that's all I'm going to say because it's, whatever. But if you talk about me carrying a weapon, I'm just going to be flat honest with you. And this is me. I'm not trying to tell you this is the right way or the way you should do it. This is just me, my own personal view. For me to carry a weapon in terms of protection is more so about my wife and children than it is about me. I'm not trying to protect. I'm not really that concerned as much, and I know that sounds weird, as much protecting myself as I am concerned protecting them. They're my number one. If you say, why are you carrying a pistol for protection? For them. For them. And I believe that this room is probably full of husbands and dads that will say, yep. It's more so in terms of protection for them than it is just me. But there are moms in this room who, when you think about your kids, protection, right? If I can get my hands on something that I can use as a weapon to help me protect, I'm going to do it, right? I'll pick up anything and swing it as a weapon if it means protecting mine that I love. Well, this is your weapon. this is your weapon. If you think that just your tenacity and just your anger and just your frustration and how loud you can sing and how loud you can pray and how much you can attend church and all this kind of stuff is going to be a formidable weapon, no. This is the weapon. Not a weapon, the weapon. This is it. This is the thing right here that you ride into an enemy camp. This is the thing that you better be declaring before the enemy. If you expect to chop him down to reclaim your stuff, this is what you chop him down with. This is the only thing that works. When you talk about the shield of faith is that thing that to me promotes the rest. Excuse me. The shield promotes the rest. That's my faith, my confidence in God, as we just mentioned with my identity. Because I have a shield, I know that every dart that the enemy is going to fire back at me. Because here's the revelation you may not have thought of. If you ride into enemy camp to take your stuff back, he's going to fight back. He's going to resist. Don't be amazed if you ride back in there and it takes longer than 5 minutes. Don't be amazed if it takes longer than one trip to the altar. Don't be amazed if it takes longer than one prayer group session. It may be one of the things where you have to keep circling, and keep circling, and keep circling, and keep attacking, and chipping, and chipping, and chipping away at that band of rebels until you get your stuff back. But what the faith, what the shield is going to do is give you that opportunity to know that every dart that he fires back at me, it's not up to my agility or my quickness or my reflexes to dodge those darts. The shield just takes the blunt of them. Every accusation, every resistance, every no, every voice of condemnation, every voice of you deserve to be here, every voice of this is all your fault, the shield of faith absorbs every single one of those. But I've watched people go in, they got a weapon, they got all this stuff, but they don't have a shield. And they walk in and they start praying for restoration because of what was lost. And yeah, it was somewhat my fault because I made bad decisions. Or maybe you didn't. Maybe it was nothing to do. It's just one of the things Satan's attack. And Satan says, you know they're in my possession because of your fault. Your stupid decisions. That's why they're with me now. And they go, oh, he's right. Guys, this is all my fault. I don't even know why I've asked you to be here. If y'all want to fight for your stuff, go ahead, but I'm just going to go over here and beat myself up and condemn myself and judge myself and ridicule myself. No. When Satan says, this is all your fault, yeah, I know. I done talked with the Lord about it. He's done forgave me, and he's given me the green light to be back here to reclaim. Mm-hmm. We can't get caught up in Satan's counterattacks. We can't get caught up in the blame game. You have to realize the things that God has entrusted you with, fruit of the Spirit, gifts, relationships, opportunities. There's so many things that God has entrusted with us. Who can be trusted with little can be trusted with much more. In the Old Testament, there is law that if I borrow something from you, let's say I borrow Kevin's ox. Kevin's trusting me with his ox. And in the midst of it being in my care, it was stolen. According to law, I owe Kevin an ox. I can be like, man, look, that thing you gave me just wouldn't stay in the pen, man. Your ox is just out of control. I tried to... No. He trusted me with it. It was lost under my care. It's my responsibility to go get him another one and replace it. God has entrusted you. He has placed stuff into your care. Guard this. Protect this. Grow this. Nurture this. Provide. We made a mistake. Okay. When we talked about last week, don't sit there on the hilltop lacking the confidence to go into battle because you're too busy looking at the road that you got crooked last week. God has trusted me with my children. He's trusted me with my wife. He's trusted me with this body. Has Satan attacked this body? Oh, yeah. Has he attacked my family? Oh, yeah. Is he attacking at this very moment? Oh, yeah. He's been doing some old school stuff the last week, stuff he hadn't done in years. But he's attacking. What am I going to do? Well, whatever's going to be, will be. No. There's too many promises here. God is too faithful. He's entrusted me. I cover this stuff with the Word. I'm going to cover these things with prayer. Guys, it is too good. It is too valuable. It's too precious for us just to let Satan continue to have his way unchecked when there's been so much promise, so much authority, so much power. I want to challenge you to pray, Lord, what has been stolen from me? That I just let it go. I was so distracted, so overwhelmed, that I'd let it go, and I never once even considered about getting it back. And don't sit there and be like, well, it's too long gone now. It's been gone for so long. Look, man, I've had people come to me. I know, go to Righteous Oaks every month, and I've had so many guys up there who have wrestled with addiction, and then they go here. They're there for 6 months. That's a long time. And while they're there, they're getting reports that their wife has packed the kids up and left, and they're wrecked. And I've seen this a handful of times, but the same thing every time. I've lost my wife. I've lost my kids. I've lost everything because of my decision. God's never going to help me get this back. They're just gone. And no, they're not. No, they're not. Have you even sought the Lord about it? Well no. Why? I mean, they're gone. I've seen it too many times, guys. These men will humble themselves before the Lord. They've repented of their actions. They're done with the decisions that got them here. We're done with that. We're over that. We're past that. Now, Lord, I'm needing your help restoring. I'm needing your help putting pieces back together. And I only go up there once a month, and so a few months pass by. And if I've seen it once, I've seen it a dozen times. They come in and be like, man, you're not going to believe who came this weekend and seen me. My wife and kids. And we had the most fantastic day. It's amazing what God will do if we will consider him and seek him. Instead of getting swept up in our emotions and overwhelmed by what has been lost and overwhelmed by the fact that we have been attacked, why does Satan care about me? I'm just minding my own business. I ain't even doing that much. He hates you, man. You're made in the image of God. He knows how much the Father loves you. He hates your guts. Yeah, he's going to attack you. But that don't mean that you're just a helpless victim who mourns on the hill and, oh, what I once had. No, man. Go seek the Lord. Be emboldened by his presence. Take up the sword. Take up your shield. Take up your helmet of salvation. Grab your identity. Grab the promises. Grab the truth and go get your stuff back. Mm-hmm. Fall on your face before the Lord. Don't be so prideful as to sit there and continue to condemn yourself. That's prideful. There's no condemnation for those in Christ Jesus. Get up. Go get the weaponry God has entrusted you with and go get your stuff back. But that's the funny part. Because when our stuff is actually recovered, we really can't take much credit for it. We can't say because I fought hardly and fiercely in battle. We rode in swift and I swung the sword great. Like, man, I sought the Lord. I focused in his word. I remained in his presence. And it was he who restored my family. It was him who put back what Satan had torn down. Paul said, we plant the seed and we water it, but man, it's God who sends the growth. When David got his men back, the guys were obviously happy, but I believe David had settled in his heart, man, had the Lord not been with us and been for us in this, dude, we'd have been done. And right after this, Saul is going to die in that battle where the Philistines go. Saul dies, and not long after this, David is king. Officially. Finally. It's amazing what happens on the other side of this stuff. It's all this crazy story. David's coming home, and now he's going to be king, and everything's going to be great, and it's just like, it's wild. But we have to stay the course. Don't give up on him, man. Don't give up on this stuff. Don't get so consumed with the destruction that you just give up. Realize, yeah, the enemy fires darts. Yeah, he's tore up a lot of stuff. Yeah, he's kidnapped some very valuable things. But greater is the Lord. The Lord is just greater, man. And I want to ensure that my family, I want to ensure that nobody gets hauled back to where I was a slave at. God delivered me out of that, and I'm going to make sure that my kids, my grandkids, my nieces, my nephews don't get hauled back to those places of slavery. And I will fight to the day that I die to make sure that none of my loved ones go back there. None of them. And by fighting, I mean resting and trusting and seeking the Lord, yielding the sword, remaining steadfast in prayer, holding up the good fight of faith. And look, I want to close with this. Let's stop saying it this way. Let's stop saying, all we can do is pray. We say that, don't we? And it ain't necessarily what we're saying, it's how we're saying it. We're saying it like, that's all we can do. Thankfully, that's all we can do. The prayer of a righteous person is what? Powerful and effective, right? God, thank you that I have prayer. Thankful that I have communion with you. Thankful, Lord, that you are stronger beyond my wildest imaginations and wiser than my wildest imaginations. Thank you for that, Father. Thank you for prayer. I'm grateful for that. Father, I just pray over this room now. For hearts that are here, Lord, maybe they're counting costs. Maybe there's somebody sitting in this room right now, Lord, that is counting the cost of what's been stolen, what's been lost. Maybe they're judging themselves. Maybe they're only considering the fact that this stuff was only lost because I chose to flee the land, go into enemy territory. Had I not done that, the stuff wouldn't be lost. Lord, that may be true and that may be well. As in the case of David, it was true. But that doesn't mean that you are saying that towards David. Lord, we don't have here where David sought you and you said back to him, yep, you're right, David. If you hadn't done this, this is what happened. So because this is your fault, I'm out of it. No. There was forgiveness. There was grace. And restoration. Lord, if we continue reading on down in verse 30, it says that they got back every single thing that was stolen. No thing was lost. From the small to the great, nothing was lost. Every single thing was accounted for. Every child, every wife, every cow, every sheep, every goat, everything was restored. Father, I just pray now for this room to be full of people that do what David did, to strengthen themselves in you in this time. In this time of desperation and panic and fear, that they would strengthen themselves in you. They would center themselves and consider you. And let you guide them into battle for the restoration of what has been stolen. Thank you, Father, for that victory. Thank you so much for your heart. The heart of restoration, God. Thank you. We bless you, Father, and ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.